My name is Jeannie Shanzano. I'm a political scientist and a writer. A few months ago, my most recent book, American Democracy in Crisis, was published. And since it is now the summer of 2025, and we are at the beginning of a year of celebrations that will culminate next year on July 4th, 2026, when we celebrate the 250th signing of the Declaration of Independence, I wanted to use this time to record a series of videos that speak to both this important milestone and some of the major themes of my latest book. I'm going to start each of these videos with a quote and then say a few words about it. So the quote I chose for today is the following: "Government deficits, the spiraling imbalance of trade, inconsistencies in foreign policy, illegal immigration, unemployment, the decay of our cities, the abuse of the environment, the staggering cost of elections, and the piracy of special interest groups. These problems and a host of others have led thoughtful citizens to question whether our political system is capable of meeting the challenges of modern governance." Now, listening to this quote, you may think that the author is speaking in 2025, but he is not. The author is someone many of you may not be familiar with, a political scientist named Donald L. Robinson from Smith College in Massachusetts. And he wrote these words 40 years ago in this book, which was a book put out in the context of another important anniversary in American history, the bicentennial, the 200th anniversary of the Constitution. That anniversary, like the upcoming 250th anniversary, was important for many reasons, including the fact that research shows that it is during these types of anniversaries, what some people think of as moments of civic renewal, that interest in reforming our governmental system increases. And I'm going to quote here from a book by another wonderful political scientist, John R. Weil, whose work shows that it's not just anniversaries which engender interest in reform, but another moment, and those are moments of crisis or perceived crises. And so both the 1987 bicentennial and the upcoming 250th, these are anniversaries, and these are examples of the kind he's talking about that trigger interest in reform. In terms of crises, he talks about things like the Civil War, World War II, the Civil Rights Movement, the Vietnam era, all of which increased interest in talk of reform. The most recent crises we've seen, which has done this, is the January 6th insurrection at the Capitol. After that, and through today, in fact, we have seen increased interest among the American public in polls in terms of reform and also concern about the health of democracy. And the latest example of that is a June 2025 poll from NPR, Marist, and PBS, which showed that more than three quarters of Americans are concerned about democracy in the United States being under threat. Since the subtitle of my book is American Democracy in Crisis, it probably comes as no surprise that I too am interested in reform and the type of reform talk that grows out of anniversaries and, God forbid, crises. Unfortunately, there's another reality that those of us interested in reform have to contend with. And that is the fact that the further we get away from these types of anniversaries, or again, God forbid, crises, the less likely there is to be, number one, interest in reform, number two, talk of reform, and number three, action towards reform. And this is something we have seen throughout American history. So in keeping with the old maxim that history may not repeat itself, but it often rhymes, it comes as no surprise then that in the wake of the January 6th crisis, we've seen a similar pattern. The further we've gotten away from the events of that day, the less urgency there is regarding reform. People are still concerned, but movement towards reform has started to quell and subside. You can see this, for example, the Council on Foreign Relations, a member, Christopher Tuttle, wrote a piece on the second anniversary of January 6th, in which he said, in the months since the rioters breached the U.S. Capitol, the capacity of the American system to overcome even the gravest challenges has quietly been on display. And then he analogized the American experiment to a patient on life support, saying the patient is still plagued with a chronic illness. And thanks to its natural defense mechanisms, the prognosis may not be as dire as some have warned. And then he asked whether those proposing reform, whether those remedies, as he called them, for the American state, are prescriptions that are too invasive. And quoting Virgil, he cautioned that in some instances, the treatment may be worse than the disease. And so in this instance, Tuttle is a perfect example of what we see historically. An anniversary or a crisis, a spike in reform talk, as I call it, or interest in reform. And then slowly, as you move further and further away from the event, the thought is either the system held and no longer needs to be reformed, or as Tuttle talked about, the reforms under consideration are going to be worse than the disease itself. Another example of this, by the way, happened in the wake of Watergate. There was a lot of interest in reform, as you can imagine, in the wake of the Watergate scandal. About a decade after that, another political scientist, James Q. Wilson, wrote an essay in which he discussed his amusement at reading or rereading an essay wrote in 1974 by Charles Hardin. And Hardin had spoken at that time about the government being in crisis and calling on constitutional surgery to correct it. The crisis, Wilson said after chuckling, ended without any of these cures that Hardin was talking about. Watergate was handled by the normal constitutional procedures, and the presidency, Wilson said, and the president are once again held in high repute. So if history is any guide, then even if the upcoming anniversary, or God forbid the next crisis, do engender talk of reform, over time interest in that reform will fade. And this is unfortunate, because unless we work to normalize reform talk and begin to think about reasoned, methodical, collegial, and peaceful ways to fix what's ailing the system, over time we can't be surprised if the system becomes increasingly vulnerable. The quote I started with from Robinson ends with the following, and I'll just read this to you. He says, "We stand in awe of the wise men who framed the Constitution nearly 2 centuries ago. But as they themselves anticipated, changing circumstances demand a reassessment." And this is an apt description not only of where, again, Robinson found himself at the bicentennial, but where we find ourselves today as we approach the 250th anniversary. We are the lucky beneficiaries of a system that the framers themselves said needs to be reassessed and revised over time by future generations. 250 years since the Declaration of Independence, we have not made good on this promise, but we should.